Today, on Brief History, we take a look at one of the shortest reigning monarchs in British history. Growing up under the domineering presence of his king father, he would develop into a charming and well-liked, yet restless young man. But as he aged, it would become clear that this future king would be unfit to rule his dominions, as his decision-making and judgment would be clouded by emotion. Join me as I take a brief look at Prince David, remembered today as King Edward VIII of the United Kingdom. Prince Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David was born on June 23, 1894, at White Lodge, Richmond Park in Surrey, England. He was the son of King George V of the United Kingdom, who, at the time, was the heir to the heir of the British crown, and Edward's mother was Mary of Teck. Although Edward today is known by the name Edward, it should be noted that in his youth, this is not what he was referred to as. Instead, it was the last of his long line of names, David, that he was referred to regularly by his close family. Nevertheless, for simplicity purposes, he will be referred to as Edward here. At the time of Edward's birth in 1894, his great-grandmother Queen Victoria was still alive and living through her final years as one of the longest reigning monarchs in British history. Edward's grandfather, the future Edward VII, was also alive and serving as Prince of Wales, the heir to Victoria's crown. Edward's father had only recently come into the direct line of succession, as young Prince Edward's uncle, elder brother to his father, a man named Albert Victor, had died only a couple years prior to Edward's birth in 1892. This death elevated Edward's father in the line of succession, and thus also put young Edward directly in line as well after his father. Interestingly, Edward's mother had initially been betrothed to his uncle Albert Victor prior to Albert Victor's death, but subsequently was betrothed to Edward's father after Albert Victor had died. Thus, Edward was brought into the world being third in the line of succession behind his grandfather and father. His parents would have 6 children together, and one of these siblings, a younger brother named Albert, will come up again throughout the rest of Edward's story. Edward grew up in a strict home, with both his father and mother allegedly showing their children little affection as they grew. Edward's father, George, had been sent to the Navy at a young age, and this had morphed him into a short-tempered and demanding man. Thus, affection was not regularly shown to Edward or his siblings, as scoldings and beatings were a regular occurrence in the household. However, it should be noted that although life was strict for Edward and his siblings, it was not completely absent of affection at all. Edward and his family eventually moved to York Cottage on the Sandringham estate, and he, along with his siblings, were put through a restrictive early life, with his education taken up by a man named Henry Hansel. Edward would spend much of his time with his eldest younger brother Albert, but the two brothers would develop very different personalities as they aged. Edward was quick-witted and dominant, while his younger brother was a stammering, shy, and anxious introvert. Both boys did not do well in their schooling, and Edward was said to have been restless when it came to his studies. The old Queen Victoria died in 1901 when Edward was 7, bringing his already aging grandfather to the throne as Edward VII. As Edward and his brother grew older, their father decided that, despite the poor education the Navy had provided for himself, he would send both of his eldest sons into the Navy as well. Thus, in 1907, when Edward was 12, he was sent to the Naval College at Osborne on the Isle of Wight, where he continued in a strict environment of learning. Moving on from Osborne to Dartmouth in 1909, his education was interrupted when his grandfather Edward VII died a short time later in 1910, bringing Edward's father to the throne as George V. Edward, only 16 years old in 1910, was now the heir apparent to the British crown. Little did anyone know what trouble laid ahead for the young prince. Edward, after his grandfather's death, was elevated to the position of Duke of Cornwall and was made the Prince of Wales. This unfortunately meant that Edward would have to play a more significant role for the monarchy, especially when it came to ceremonial roles, which he was not said to have enjoyed. After completing his naval training, he traveled to Magdalen College, Oxford, in 1910 to continue his education, but again he fell short of expectations, being already behind due to his previous educational failures. During this time, Edward was able to enjoy some leisure, playing football, squash, and cricket, and he also rode, hunted, smoked, drank alcohol, gambled, and drove. Even with this leisure time, Edward was said to have not enjoyed his time at Oxford, as he still had an overbearing, disapproving father harping on him at all times, and a tutor who continued to attempt to keep him in line. The gap between what Edward's father expected of him and how Edward actually carried himself would continuously grow as time went on. Edward saw his father as a stuffy, narrow-minded critic, while the king saw his son and heir as a fast, undisciplined wastrel. The divide was furthered by the outbreak of World War I in 1914. Edward was intent on serving in the war in a fighting capacity, but the king would hear none of this. Edward was first stationed in Britain before being sent to France to remain well behind the front. Although the future king did at times find himself in danger, with people close to him dying, these experiences were few and far between, and Edward continued to feel held back due to his position as heir. That is not to say that he did not do his part for the war effort. He did, and played a particularly important role in raising morale when he visited troops in hospitals. Nevertheless, he was awarded medals and promotions that he did not deserve, and this embarrassed the prince more than placated him. The resentment continuously grew, not only towards his father, but also simply towards the position that he constantly found himself in, which left him suppressed and wanting. Edward did not have a choice in being the heir to the British crown, and despite the positives that came along with such a prestigious position, Edward focused more on the negative sides of his situation, which conflicted with his personality. The detestation and anger he felt towards his position at times grew so serious that he allegedly contemplated suicide at one point. Despite these internal feelings that the prince was experiencing, he was generally very popular with the people in Britain, as he was attractive and still thought to have played his part in the war effort well, no matter how disappointed he may have been with what he was actually doing at the time. So emerged the two sides of Edward: the public, well-maintained, glittering persona who interacted with the public well and was generally well-liked, and the private, suppressed, and gloomy king-in-waiting, chomping at the bit to have freedom, fun, and a life of excess on his own. As we will see shortly, these two sides would mix in Edward's future like oil and water. One aspect of Edward's private life that began to take on more and more importance with him was his relationship with women and his intimate interactions with them. After interacting sexually with a prostitute in 1916, Edward's interest in women became more of an obsession, and he was said to have been a known womanizer. This would manifest specifically in Edward being interested in married women, which will become an important aspect of his future, as we will see shortly. As the Great War came to an end, with Britain and her allies being victorious, Edward entered into the next stage of his public life, being sent on tours around the world to represent the monarchy. He was said to have done well in this capacity, at least on the surface, but below the facade of smiles and friendly handshakes existed an undereducated, immature, and pent-up young man, nervous and eager to break free from the perceived bonds of royal duty. The fast life of excess continued, or perhaps even grew to new levels, and he began to show signs of unreliableness, being prone to impunctuality and distraction. For this, the king continued to criticize his son, with the gap between Edward's true personality and his public persona continuing to widen. But Edward was about to make two life-changing decisions that would change his life and legacy forever, and neither of these would be in any way positive. As the First World War came to an end, Germany had been forced into a punitive peace that left many Germans feeling angry and eager to return to a day when Germany was a national and important power. Nationalistic pride grew considerably, and this brought forth authoritarian leaders who rode this wave of nationalism to the top of government. In Germany, this nationalistic wave was, of course, led by the infamous Führer, Adolf Hitler, whose Nazi party began to grow substantially during the 1930s. Edward was unfortunately one who was hoodwinked by Hitler's charismatic prose. The young prince began to favor Germany, and especially the Nazis, who he saw as a strong party within a strong nation who could stand up to communism being something that Edward abjectly detested. Many today believe that Edward was anti-Semitic, and in reality this was probably true, but it has been put forward that, in addition to his detestation of communism, part of the reason Edward was drawn to the Nazis was due to his personality and love of fashion and style. Both he and his father were sticklers for dress, and the Nazi leadership focused much on this aspect as well within their authoritarian regime. Edward did not know at the time the danger that the Third Reich presented to Britain, or the terrible genocide that the Nazis were planning on inflicting on the Jewish population. Nevertheless, his friendly relations with Germany has, rightfully, tarnished his reputation beyond repair, and as we will see, will go far beyond just a friendly nod. The second major decision that Edward made that would change his life forever was his decision in a woman. Edward, as we already briefly touched on, had come to enjoy married women in his company. One of the first of these women was Freda Dudley Ward, a married woman from a wealthy family who became his regular mistress. After Freda came a woman named Thelma Furness, an also married half-American woman who Edward took up with just the same. But the woman who would come to the forefront and change Edward's life drastically was an already once divorced, at the time married American woman named Wallis Simpson. She was an attractive, strong-willed, and active socialite who Edward fell for immediately. The prince became so infatuated with her that at one point, after their friendly relationship turned into adultery, it seemed that Wallis had full control over the Prince of Wales, being dominant and controlling in the relationship to the point that she could compel Edward to do whatever she pleased. Edward's father, the king, was incensed by the relationship and essentially threw in the towel, expressing his hope that his younger son, Albert, Edward's younger brother, would one day inherit the throne. The aging king prophetically predicted that his son would ruin himself within 12 months of coming to the throne. Little did King George know how right he would be and the incredible decisions that his son would make after his death. But the king by that time was a sick and dying man. In January 1936, to ease his suffering and to time his death with the morning papers, the royal doctors gave Edward's father a lethal concoction of medication which ended his life. Edward, 41 years old, was now the king of Britain. Edward may have been king, but there were major issues that he would need to overcome, and there were many, which included those in the know about Wallis Simpson, who were very concerned by the situation that was at hand. Edward, generally speaking, was still quite popular and commanded respect from the populace at the time of his accession, but most within the kingdom did not know about his relationship with Wallis Simpson and the trouble that this could and would bring. Wallis Simpson, being an American, already divorced once, and at the time seeking a second divorce, could not be considered, at that time in the 1930s, an appropriate queen consort to Edward. But we remember that Edward's infatuation and love for Wallis went extremely deep, and it soon became clear that he would not be willing to part with the woman that he so revered. In fact, it soon became clear that it was his intention to marry Wallis, which many knew would surely bring forth a crisis. Furthermore, he approved both of Hitler's aggressive moves on the continent and Mussolini's aggressive moves in North Africa, which gave cause for serious concern. The king was spied on by members of his government, as it seemed clear that both he and Wallis Simpson had foreign sympathies that could be detrimental to Britain. However, it was not long before the king's relationship with Simpson reached the public eye, and scandalous whispers began to creep through the masses. There were discussions on Edward perhaps keeping Simpson as a secret mistress, hidden in the background of his kingship, but the king would hear none of this, and continued to look forward to Simpson's divorce being finalized so that he could finally marry her and make her his consort. But Edward was no fool, and he knew that there were very few, if any, who would be willing to accept Wallis Simpson in the role of consort. By November, Edward formally summoned his prime minister and indicated that he intended to marry Mrs. Simpson, and that if necessary, he would renounce his right to the throne in favor of his younger brother Albert so that he could marry the woman that he loved. Albert, who was caught off guard by this development, was terrified that he was unfit to be king in his brother's place. As the scandalous news began to leak out, public anger began to quell, and Wallis Simpson became the focus of this anger. She was vilified in the press, had stones thrown through her windows, and was delivered to her door piles and piles of hate mail, despite the fact that for a time she urged Edward towards kingship without her. Edward, however, was in too deep and refused to let Wallis go. By December, the king was anxious to be done with the whole mess, as public opinion turned against the once darling of the nation. Many saw Edward as abandoning his people and his duty to his nation in order to pursue his private passions. This, in truth, was not all that inaccurate, and it was clear that this sequence of events was going to severely damage the prestige of the monarchy. Edward, already convinced that abdication was the right move, turned his attention to securing a positive financial settlement as he geared up to leave the throne behind him. Once this was secured, the young king was finally ready to make his move. On December 10th, 1936, after only 326 days as monarch of Britain, King Edward VIII of the United Kingdom signed the Instrument of Abdication, officially renouncing his claim to the British crown. He and Wallace were subsequently made Duke and Duchess of Windsor, with Edward giving a farewell broadcast to the nation the following day. This was a shocking turn of events, which left many angry and dumbfounded. But unfortunately, this was only the beginning, as this would not be the end of the drama for Edward. There were still many more blunders waiting in the ranks for the former king. Although Wallis Simpson was made Duchess of Windsor, she was not given any type of royal status as Edward had hoped, and this would be something that the former king was not only very angry about, but something that he would continue to push for unsuccessfully for the rest of his life. Edward and his brother, the new King George VI, despite having a close childhood and early adulthood, now found in each other an opponent, and the relationship between the brothers quickly deteriorated. This was aided by the fact that Wallis Simpson was, in essence, detested by much of the royal family, including Edward's mother and George VI's queen consort Elizabeth, both of which refusing to speak to Wallis. There emerged an interesting and unfortunate dynamic between Edward and his brother the new king, which would bring forth trouble for the Duke of Windsor. Despite Edward's abdication and the fact that he had never been crowned, he was still a former king within his former kingdom, and this was, understandably, concerning to George VI. Edward's brother was forced to pick up the pieces of the mess that Edward had left behind, and would have to do this with his brother being a potential alternative type of monarch just hanging around Britain. George had always been the shy and anxious yet respectable and conforming brother, which didn't always contrast well publicly with Edward, who had been much more charming and extroverted in his youth. Unsurprisingly, George was concerned that Edward could, even in his status as Duke of Windsor, outshine him as king or become the center of opposition. This meant that George wanted his elder brother out of the country in order that the former king could not remain as a popular public figure, which might undermine him in his new position on the throne. This, unsurprisingly, only furthered the resentment between the brothers. George VI, however, had the backing of the establishment, and soon Edward's face and personality was wiped clean from public spaces. George VI was the face of Britain now, and there was little sympathy for the former king. Edward crossed into France to begin what was in essence an exile from his homeland, being shunned by his family and friends. Edward and Wallis married soon after, with none of Edward's family being present at the wedding. Unfortunately, Edward did not choose to lie in the bed that he had made and attempted to continue his life as a public figure, which led to further poor decision-making. In October 1937, Edward, accompanied by Wallis, visited Nazi Germany, which was seized upon by the Nazi propaganda machine to present this as a quasi-royal progress. It is believed that Hitler even thought that Edward could have possibly been used as a puppet king if Britain was one day brought to heel under the Nazi regime. The new Duke of Windsor seemed to be in a perpetual state of blunder and greatly embarrassed his brother, despite the fact that the British press tried to downplay the visit as much as they could. Again, it is unlikely that Edward knew the danger that the Nazis presented to the world at the time, but it nevertheless has reflected poorly on him today and was at the very least unwise and disrespectful to his brother. Edward's attempts to return home at times were blocked, as the anxious relationship with his family and homeland continued on. When World War II broke out and he was offered passage back to Britain, he initially refused unless he and Wallis were received at a royal residence, showing that Edward had his own personal desires still ahead of all else. During the war, it was decided that Edward would need a job to keep him out of trouble, and so he was sent back to France for a time before being forced to flee to Spain after Hitler advanced west into France. He was summoned back to England, but once again attempted to demand terms that would benefit him and Wallis before returning. He furthermore requested that Germany protect his property in France after they had invaded and occupied the nation. Again, with one of the world's worst conflicts raging next door and Britain's safety as a whole in danger, Edward was more focused in seeing that his wife was accepted within the royal family and that his property was looked after. After this, the Windsors were sent to the Bahamas, where Edward served as governor for 5 years, which he was said to have detested. While there, he exhibited defeatist behavior, commenting that it would be pointless for America to enter the war as it was too late to defeat Germany and its Axis allies. Luckily for Britain, who had been battered by the Luftwaffe during the Blitz, America did enter the war, and the Allies were able to ultimately defeat Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and Fascist Italy to win World War II. Edward resigned his post in the Bahamas in 1945 and returned back to Britain, where he would begin his final chapter as a former king of Britain. After the war, Edward continued to resist remaining out of the public eye and was not keen on settling down in France to live a quiet life. He hoped to become some form of an ambassador to America, but this was not forthcoming, and so he began to live a bored and restless life in the French countryside. He wrote a memoir titled A King's Story, but was still shunned by the royal family for the most part in Britain, with Wallace still being denied a royal rank. In 1952, Edward's brother the king died and was succeeded by his daughter Elizabeth, who became Queen Elizabeth II. Edward traveled to Britain and was partially reconciled with his mother, Queen Mary, after the death of his brother, although little change took place with regard to Wallace or the royal family at large. Edward and Wallace were not invited to Elizabeth's coronation, and it seemed clear that this would most likely be how things ended for the former king. However, this would not be the case. Edward and his niece, the Queen's relationship, would improve over the years, and he and Wallace were both finally invited to Britain in 1967 for an event. They were also granted permission to be buried at Frogmore, near Windsor, where Edward's great-grandparents, Victoria and Albert, had been laid to rest. Edward's final years were said to have been aimless and unfulfilling, with Wallace having a quasi-affair during this time, which greatly troubled the aging Duke. As the decades passed, Edward's memory and hearing began to deteriorate, and by 1971, he was diagnosed with throat cancer. In May 1972, at his home in France, the former King Edward VIII of the United Kingdom, Duke of Windsor, died at the age of 77. He was allowed to lie in state at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, where tens of thousands of people came to pay their respects despite the tumultuous experience he had had in his past. Edward was laid to rest in the Royal Burial Ground at Frogmore, near Windsor Castle. He lies here next to Wallis Simpson, the woman who he gave up a crown for to this day. The life and short reign of Edward VIII was unfortunate in almost all aspects. From his youth, Edward did not fit well into the life that was being created for him, and despite the affable personality and charming character that he exhibited, the structured and oftentimes monotonous life of princely learning did not suit him well. As he grew into a man, the cold and oftentimes loveless childhood that he experienced surely influenced his desires to find someone that he could live happily and openly with to fill this void. But the world was not yet ready for the type of relationship that Edward chose, and it is unfortunate that his connection with Wallis Simpson was so scandalous. With the softening of attitudes towards divorce and love matches, today Edward would most likely not have had to endure the scandal that erupted as a result of his choices, and for this, perhaps he deserves some leeway. But what sympathy one can find for Edward when considering his relationship with Wallis Simpson must surely be matched by a degree of indignation at the choices he made, the seemingly brash carelessness that he made these choices, and the harsh reality of the situation that he and the world was in at that time. Would we today look at his relationship with Wallis Simpson differently, and do we now know that forced relationships in royal families may lead to more trouble than necessary? Yes, but regardless of this, that was not how things were in Edward's time, and many believe that Edward had a duty to Britain, to the monarchy, to his family, and to himself, whether he liked it or not, and should have put his personal desires aside for the greater good. His decision to cast aside those who looked to him for leadership for his own personal passions caused great harm or potential great harm to the monarchy, and put many, most notably his brother, in extremely difficult and precarious positions. The only positive thing that can possibly be said about Edward's abdication is that it removed a king who had sympathies which lay in all the wrong places. Although his connection to Nazi Germany may have been less driven by ideology than many people suppose, or may be overstated at times, this connection still, at the very least, indicates a degree of perhaps immaturity or lack of reason, as Edward was drawn towards what almost all others in Britain rightly recoiled from. Nevertheless, however one sees Edward as an unfortunate and charming king who was unfairly treated for simply following his heart, or as a philandering traitor king who turned his back on his country and people for his own personal interests, it cannot be doubted that his short time as king brought forth drama that had not existed in Britain for many years, and hopefully will not arise again for many more.